Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into something, well, pretty wild.
Yeah, what have we got?
A stack of sources exploring this centuries-old prophecy about the Catholic Church's future, its leaders.
Ah, that one. The prophecy of popes. St. Malachi, right?
Exactly. And we're looking at how historical errors suggest parts of it might be um, a clever fake.
But also how people have tried to make it fit history, even recent history.
Right, and how different timelines people have cooked up seem to point to, like, 2027 for its conclusion.
Which is soon.
Very soon. And then get this, some really recent news from the Vatican that might just, change the whole game.
Okay, intriguing. It's definitely a mix of history, belief, maybe some politics, too.
For sure. This prophecy, it's been influential kind of quietly for ages. Understanding it gives you a unique lens on things.
Absolutely. So what are the sources saying? Historical accounts, analyses.
Yep, historical stuff. Deep dives into the text itself, its very suspicious origins, analyses trying to match it to popes, and yeah, a news report from just the other day adds a whole new layer.
So the mission today.
Let's unpack it all. See what these sources say about the prophecy's claims, the big debate over whether it's real.
And how recent papal stuff, Benedict, Francis, and now this new development, stacks up against its predictions.
Exactly. Because these aren't just dusty old ideas, are they? They pop up during big changes in the church.
Especially around papal elections, yeah.
Yeah.
They touch on these fundamental questions about the future.
Right. So we have this text predicting an endpoint, centuries of interpretation, speculation heating up lately.
And now something totally unexpected happens. Okay, I'm ready. Let's dive in.
Okay, so first off, what exactly is this prophecy? The prophecy of St. Malachys.
Well, at its core, it's basically a list. 112 short, often pretty cryptic Latin phrases, mottos, really.
And the origin story is dramatic in itself, isn't it? Attributed to St. Malachys.
Yeah, Archbishop of Armagh, way back in the 12th century.
The story goes he had this vision in Rome, saw all future popes.
That's the legend, yeah. But here's where it gets interesting right away, looking at the sources. This document, nobody knew about it in Malachi's time, or for centuries after.
Really?
It only pops up, gets published much, much later, 1595.
Wow, okay.
In a book called Lignum Vitae by a Benedictine monk, Arnold Vian.
So this text, predicting the church's future, appears over 450 years after the supposed author died.
Bingo. And for historians digging into this, that massive gap is like the first major red flag.
I bet. So what's the actual premise? Each phrase is a pope.
Pretty much. Each motto corresponds to a pope, starting with Celestine II in 1143.
Okay.
But the really striking thing is the end. The 112th entry. It's not another short phrase.
No.
It's a longer paragraph, more descriptive. Ominous, some would say.
And that's the bit that gets everyone talking, especially now, right, as the list seems to be running out.
Exactly. The big question is always, does the new pope fit the motto? And what happens at number 112?
But historically, people did find connections, right? That's why it gained traction.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Especially early on, interpreters found what they saw as really compelling links that fueled belief.
Give us some examples the sources highlight, the striking fits.
Sure. Okay, the very first one. Pope Celestine II. His motto is Ex Castro Tiberis, from the castle of the Tiber. And guess what? Celestine II was born in Città di Castello, a town right on the Tiber River.
Okay, that's pretty direct. Hard to argue with that one.
Right. Then you've got Benedict XIV, his motto, Frigidus Abbas.
Cold abbot.
Yep. And he was a Benedictine monk. The name Benedict itself makes you think of the order. It's, rigor.
Okay. A bit more interpretive, but I see the link.
And Pius XII, Pastor Angelicus. Angelic shepherd.
That sounds pretty flattering.
And people at the time often described him that way, focusing on his, deep spirituality, almost mystical vibe.
So it's not always literal geography. It can be background, name, even reputation.
Exactly. And notice, as you get closer to 1595, when it was published, the fits seem, well, maybe even more specific to some people.
Like who?
Okay, John Paul the Pope for just 33 days in 1978. His motto is De Medietate Lunae.
Of the half of the moon.
Yeah. And his election and death happened between moon phases. Plus, his reign was so short, like a flickering light, a half moon maybe.
Wow. That's quite poignant, actually, given how brief his papacy was.
It really is. And then his successor, John Paul II, De Labore Solis.
from the work of the sun. How do people connect that?
A few ways. His constant world travels, like the sun circling the globe, his massive work spreading the faith, and maybe the most striking, there was a solar eclipse on the day he was born, May 18th, 1920.
Whoa, okay, that specific detail does make you pause. What about Benedict VI, the one right before Francis?
Right, he's number 111 on the list, the very last motto before that final paragraph kicks in.
And his motto?
Gloria Olivae, the glory of the olive.
Olive, like peace. Or symbolizing peace. Monastic tradition. Fits his scholarly background, his chosen name, Benedict. Okay, I can definitely see why, looking at these examples, people through the centuries would go, wow, there's something to this.
Absolutely. It's compelling on the surface. But that brings us right back to the skepticism.
Which, as the sources highlight, is also pretty compelling.
Definitely. And it centers, again, on that huge time gap. Malachys in the 12th century, publication in 1595.
450 years.
Yeah.
It's a long time for prophecy to stay hidden.
Exactly. And the strongest argument against Malachys actually writing it, detailed in the sources, isn't just the gap. It's evidence the text was written after 1557.
How do they show that?
Okay, get this. There was a historian, Onofrio Panvino, who wrote a history of the popes published in 1557. Panvino made some mistakes in his history, factual errors.
Okay,
So the prophecy of St. Malachy repeats Panvino's exact mistakes for popes before 1557.
Wait, really? Like what?
Okay, example. Panvino wrongly said Pope Eugene I was a Celestine monk. He was actually Augustinian.
And the prophecy.
The motto for Eugene I includes a reference to Celestine. Another one. Panvino mistakenly claimed Pope John XXII was the son of a shoemaker from Ossa. He was actually a banker's son.
Let me guess.
The prophecy's motto for John XXII includes cobbler of Ossa.
Okay, two different documents making the exact same specific factual errors about different popes. That's pretty damning evidence.
It really is. The conclusion most researchers draw is clear. The first part of the list, up to the 1550s or maybe even 1590, wasn't prophecy.
It was written after the fact.
With historical hindsight, reverse engineered to fit popes people already knew about.
Okay, so if Malachy didn't write it, but someone closer to 1595 did, why pin it on Malachy?
Well, the sources suggest that was a smart move strategically.
How so?
Malachy was a respected saint from Ireland, which already had this kind of mystical reputation. Attributing it to him gave the text instant weight, authority.
Like borrowing credibility.
Exactly. It's a historical tactic. You graft your message onto a revered figure to make people listen.
So maybe it was even a political tool, like intended to influence the papal election around 1590.
That's a very strong theory you see in the sources. Put it out there, maybe subtly boost a candidate whose background fits the next motto on the list.
Clever. But wait, this still leaves the puzzle of the popes after 1595.
Right.
If the first part was faked, how do you explain the connections people see later? John Paul I, John Paul II, the ones we just talked about.
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? That keeps the debate going.
So what are the explanations?
Well, skeptics say it's coincidence. The mottos are often vague, symbolic. You can make them fit after the fact if you try hard enough.
Post hoc rationalization.
Basically. But there's another angle some sources mention. Once the prophecy was out there, published, maybe the awareness of it started to subtly influence things. Like maybe future popes acted in certain ways, or maybe people just perceived their papacies through the lens of the prophecy. A kind of self-fulfilling dynamic, even unconsciously.
Wow, that's fascinating. The prophecy itself shaping history just by existing.
It really speaks to the power of narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And expectation.
Okay, let's shift gears to the modern era. The end of the list. Benedict XVI, number 111, Gloria Olivae.
The glory of the olive. And his papacy ended unusually.
With his resignation in 2013, not death.
Yes. And for many who follow this prophecy, that resignation is seen as hugely significant.
How so?
They see it as the rupture, the break point. The prophecy structure has 111 mottos, then a break, then the final paragraph.
So Benedict resigning, not dying, created that break.
That's the interpretation. It created this unique transition, clearing the stage, maybe, for whatever that final paragraph describes.
A break in the normal flow.
Exactly. And some people even point out his resignation took effect on February 28th.
Yeah.
Which is the feast day of Saint Romanus of Condat. Another little nod to Romanus, perhaps even applied to the predecessor.
Interesting detail. So some saw Benedict as transitional.
Yeah, a figure whose unique departure set things up for the final act. The Petrus Romanus part.
And what came next, of course, was Pope Francis, elected after Benedict.
And crucially, Francis doesn't get one of the 111 mottos. He falls into that final paragraphs territory.
Which must have sent speculation into overdrive for prophecy watchers.
Immediately, people started scrutinizing everything about him, his early actions, through that dramatic lens.
Like what sort of things?
Okay, his very first words from the balcony, remember? He asked the crowd to pray for me.
Yeah, I remember that. Seemed humble.
Humble, yes, but some read more into it, an awareness of a huge burden, maybe even, the prophecy's weight.
Wow, that's reading a lot into it, but okay. What else?
His choice of name, Francis, evokes St. Francis of Assisi: poverty, peace, reform, returning to the church's roots.
And how does that connect?
Some saw it fitting the prophecy's vibe of tribulations leading to maybe a spiritual renewal, a purification.
Okay. And you mentioned his emphasis on being Bishop of Rome.
Yes, that was one of the first things he said. Bishop of Rome.
Which is technically correct, but...
Yeah, but putting the emphasis there right at the start struck some as a subtle nod, maybe unintentional, to the Romanus part of the final prophecy, Peter the Roman.
Interesting. What about him being the first Jesuit pope? Does that fit interpretations?
This is where it gets a bit more complicated, pulling in other threads, according to the sources.
Okay.
There's this separate tradition, sometimes loosely tied to interpretations of Nostradamus, not Malachy,
Right.
that talks about a caput negrum, a black leader maybe appearing near the end times.
Black leader.
Yeah. And since Jesuits wore black cassocks, and their superior general is sometimes nicknamed the Black Pope.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Some interpreters tried to link Francis, the first Jesuit pope, to this black leader idea, placing him right before or within Malachy's final phase.
Even though Caput Nigrum isn't actually in the Malachy text.
Exactly. It's weaving together different threads. Nostradamus also apparently mentions a black red, maybe a Jesuit cardinal, people trying to make it fit.
So using other prophecies to bolster the Malachy interpretation regarding Francis.
Pretty much. Trying to find resonance, and Francis's actions to his reform.
Vatican reforms. Curia finances.
Yes. Big changes. Trying to decentralize power a bit with that Council of Cardinals, the G8.
How does that fit the prophecy?
Some interpret the prophecy's line about the destruction of the city of Seven Hills.
Which sounds like Rome burning?
Not as literal fire and brimstone, but as a metaphor.
A metaphor for what?
For dismantling the old power structures of the papacy, the centralized, maybe corrupt system, ushering in a new era.
So destruction as transformation, not apocalypse. That's a very different read.
It absolutely is. It frames the prophecy more as a call for change, even painful change, not just doom.
Any other symbolic actions?
One more the sources mention. His first trip outside the Vatican was to the Basilica di Santa Maria Maggiore.
Okay.
And he specifically knelt at the tomb of Pope Sixtus V.
Sixtus V. Why is he significant in this prophecy context?
Because his motto, Axis in meditate signi, Axel in the midst of a sign, is the one some people use to mark the midpoint of the prophecy.
Not midpoint by count, but by time.
Exactly. It's used in those timeline calculations we mentioned. So visiting his tomb, some saw it as Francis acknowledging that, connecting to that timeline somehow.
Whether any of this is real or not, the awareness of the prophecy clearly colors how people see things.
Undeniably, it creates a lens, a narrative.
Speaking of timelines, how did they get to 2027 using Sixtus V?
Okay, so the calculation discussed in the sources goes like this. Sixtus V became pope in 1585.
Right.
Celestine II, the first on the list, started in 1143. The difference is 442 years.
Okay, 1143 to 1585 is 442 years.
So if Sixtus V really is the midpoint in time, you add another 442 years to 1585.
1585 plus 442 gets you to 2027.
Wow. So that specific calculation points to 20... mentioned separate traditions, sometimes linked to Pope John XXIII, about the end coming around 2,000 years plus the age of Christ.
Which would normally mean around 2033, give or take.
Right, 2,000 plus 33. So close to 2027, but not exactly the same.
But then there was a twist with that calculation.
Yes, involving Benedict VI again, actually. In a book he wrote about Jesus, he noted that historical scholarship suggests Jesus was likely born earlier than year 0, maybe 6 or 7 BC.
Right, due to calendar issues and Herod's death date.
Exactly. So if you take that John XXIII prophecy, 2,000 years plus the age of Christ, but use Christ's actual age based on that earlier birth date.
Meaning he'd have been around 33, sometime before 33 AD?
Right. If he was born around 6 BC, he'd be 33 around 27 AD. So 2,000 years after that.
Plus, maybe adjusting for the birth year itself gets you much closer to 2027 again.
Exactly. It potentially aligns those two different threads, the Malachys Sixtus V calculation and the John XXIII tradition, adjusted by Benedict's point about Jesus' birth year, both pointing towards 2027.
It's quite a convergence. Two separate lines of thought ending up in the same spot.
It definitely adds to the intrigue for people following this stuff.
Okay, so just to recap where we are. This debated prophecy, Benedict's resignation seen as a break, Francis potentially fitting the final phase, timelines converging on 2027.
A neat, if highly speculative, narrative building up.
And then, boom, recent news throws a curveball.
Yes. The sources cover this very recent development, the election of Pope Leo XIV.
Which is huge news anyway, the first pope from the United States.
The massive historical moment for the church. And the report notes he recently did that traditional mass, formalizing his role as Bishop of Rome.
At St. John Lateran, the cathedral. Standard procedure for a new pope.
Right. But during that mass, he said something specific.
What was the quote?
He said, "Today I can say in a special way that I am a Roman, with and for you."
I am a Roman. Whoa, just after we've been talking about Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman.
The resonance is undeniable. It just hangs there.
Now, the news source contextualizes this, right? It's symbolic.
Yes, very much so. It clarifies this is about pastoral responsibility, his spiritual connection to the Diocese of Rome. It's not like he's changing his passport or taking over the city's admin.
That's usually delegated to a vicar anyway, especially with non-Italian popes.
Exactly. It's a symbolic declaration of taking on the role, the see.
But still, the timing, the phrase, after all the speculation about Francis or maybe Cardinal Parolin being Peter the Roman.
It's remarkable because the previous speculation, documented in our other sources, was focused elsewhere. Now you have Pope Leo XIV, not named cheater, not Italian.
But explicitly saying, I am Roman, in a key liturgical moment.
So how does this fit? That's the big question this news raises.
Does Leo XIV, with this declaration, somehow fulfill the Romanist part in an unexpected way?
Or does his arrival mean the previous interpretations about Francis being the final figure were wrong? Does it push the timeline, introduce someone after the supposed end phase?
Does a Pope Leo fit anywhere? Does this challenge the whole 2027 idea built around the previous popes?
It throws a massive wrench into the neat narrative people had built. It forces a complete reevaluation for anyone trying to map current events onto that old prophecy.
Okay, let's try and pull these tangled threads together. We started with this ancient, mysterious prophecy.
Dove into the pretty strong evidence suggesting the first big chunk was likely faked, written with hindsight.
We saw how, despite that, it's been interpreted for centuries, how people found connections, fueling belief.
And how the debate still simmers about the perceived fits after it was supposedly written. Coincidence, vague phrasing, self-fulfillment.
Then we zoomed into the modern church. Benedict VI's resignation, a key break.
Pope Francis's actions, his name, his origins, all scrutinized through the prophecy's lens, sometimes woven with other traditions like Nostradamus.
And those intriguing timeline calculations using Sixtus V or John XXIII adjusted, pointing towards 2027.
And just when that narrative seems somewhat settled, albeit speculative, enter Pope Leo XIV.
The first U.S. Pope, declaring I am Roman, a totally new element.
Requiring everyone looking at this prophecy to go back to the drawing board, really.
The sources really show this dance, don't they? Between an old text, belief, skepticism, interpretation, and then just real unpredictable events.
And they remind us that the end in the prophecy itself is ambiguous. Is it apocalypse, church transformation, the end of the papacy as we knew it?
Yeah. Maybe more about dismantling old structures, like that interpretation of Francis's reforms.
And fundamentally, they show that prophecies, real or fake, ancient or modern, have power. Just by existing, being discussed, they shape how we see things.
They create expectations, influence perceptions, maybe even nudge reality sometimes.
That's a fascinating feedback loop.
So here's a final thought for you listening to this deep dive. What do you make of this convergence?
This ancient contested prophecy interpretations zeroing in on recent popes and maybe 2027?
And then the sudden arrival of Pope Leo XIV, the American Pope, declaring, I am Roman.
Does that statement offer a surprising fulfillment of Petrus Romanus, or does it blow the whole previous interpretation wide open?
Does it fit the prophecy in a way no one saw coming? Or does it signal something entirely new, beyond the old text?
And maybe the biggest question, how much does just talking about this stuff, keeping this centuries-old prophecy alive in conversation, continue to shape the story as it unfolds?
Lots to ponder there.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.